Sometimes the greatest strength comes from the most broken hearts. In a world that had forgotten her worth, one woman would prove that healing hands know no boundaries. Einar Broadback, the mightiest Viking warrior, lay dying from battle wounds that no healer could cure. His clan prepared for his funeral, but Inga, a widowed cook dismissed by most, stepped forward with quiet determination. She asked for one night alone with the dying warrior. Armed with old remedies and gentle hands, she began a healing that seemed impossible. As Einar's fever broke and strength returned, both discovered that some bonds run deeper than memory. Could love bloom between a legendary warrior and a humble widow? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Great Hall of Thornwick stood like a monument to Norse strength, its massive oak beams darkened by decades of hearth smoke and countless celebrations of victory. Tonight, however, the usual sounds of laughter and boasting had given way to hushed whispers and the shuffle of worried feet across worn stone floors. The very walls seemed to hold their breath, waiting for news that everyone feared would come with the dawn. Einar Broadback's battle-axe rested against the wall beside his bed, its blade still stained with the blood of enemies who had thought themselves clever enough to ambush the greatest warrior of the northern clans. The weapon had served him faithfully through 30 years of warfare, carving his legend into the hearts of friend and foe alike. Now, it stood as a silent sentinel, watching over its master as he fought a battle no sword could win. The warrior himself lay motionless beneath thick furs, his massive frame reduced to labored breathing that rattled in his chest like autumn leaves in a dying wind. The poisoned spear that had found its mark during the last skirmish had done what no honest blade had ever accomplished. It was slowly stealing the life from the man they called the Shield of the North. His left leg, shattered at the thigh, had been set as best the healers could manage, but the green tinge around the wound spoke of deeper corruption that their herbs could not touch. Inga Grimsdottir moved through the kitchens with practiced efficiency, her wooden spoon worn smooth by countless years of stirring, tasting, and serving. The simple utensil had become an extension of her hand, as familiar as her own fingers, yet few in Thornwick knew the true history it carried. Passed down from her grandmother's grandmother, it had once stirred more than porridge and stew. It had mixed the sacred preparations of women who understood that nourishment could heal more than hunger. At 43 winters, Inga carried herself with the steady grace of a woman who had learned to find purpose in the shadows. Her auburn hair, streaked now with silver, was always bound, back in a simple braid that spoke of practicality rather than vanity. Her hands, strong from years of kneading bread and tending fires, moved with a gentleness that seemed at odds with their obvious capability. Those who bothered to look, and few did, might have noticed how her green eyes held depths that suggested she had seen more of the world than her humble station would indicate. She had been Eric, the stout's wife, for 12 years before the fever took him, leaving her with no children and a place in the household that depended entirely on the clan's charity. Most widows in her position would have remarried quickly or been sent to live with distant relatives, but Inga had made herself indispensable through her skill in the kitchens and her quiet competence in managing the domestic affairs that kept the great hall functioning. The other servants whispered about her sometimes, wondering why she never seemed interested in the advances of the unmarried men who occasionally they noticed her. They saw only a woman growing thick around the middle, her face lined with years of work over hot fires, her hands permanently stained with the evidence of her labor. They could not see the sharp mind that catalogued every conversation she overheard, the careful observation that had taught her more about healing than most of the clan's official medicine workers would ever know. Tonight, as she prepared what might be the last meal Thornwick would eat, while their greatest defender still drew breath, Inga found her thoughts drifting to memories she had long kept buried. The sounds of despair from the great hall reminded her of another time, another place, when death had stalked through homes and hearts with equal hunger. She had been young then, barely 16, when the warriors came to her village with fire and steel. Most of what happened that day remained mercifully blurred in her memory, but some moments stood out with crystalline clarity, moments that had shaped every day of her life since. The clan's healers had exhausted their knowledge trying to save Einar. Old Ragnhild, whose remedies had pulled dozens back from death's threshold, sat in her chamber weeping like a child. She had tried every preparation in her considerable arsenal: willow bark for the fever, comfrey for the bone, even the precious betony that traders brought from distant lands. Nothing had touched the poison that flowed through the warrior's veins like liquid death. Young Thorstein, who had studied with the monks in the south and returned with foreign knowledge of healing, had attempted to bleed the corruption from Einar's body. His careful cuts and measured draining had only weakened the patient further, adding the pallor of blood loss to the flush of fever that painted the warrior's face in shades of approaching doom. Even Valdis the seer, whose reputation for wisdom extended far beyond Thornwick's borders, had cast her bones and read her signs only to shake her head in defeat. The spirits, she declared, had already marked Einar for the journey to Valhalla. His time as a guardian of the living was at an end. The great hall buzzed with the subdued activity of a community preparing for profound loss. Warriors who had fought beside Einar for decades spoke in low voices of the battles they would face, without his strength to anchor their shield wall. The younger men, who had learned courage by watching him stand unmoved against impossible odds, wondered if their own hearts would hold when the test came. Women worried about who would lead the defense if raiders came with the spring thaw, knowing that Einar's mere reputation had kept many enemies at bay. Children who had grown up on stories of his legendary deeds now faced a world where those tales might soon be all that remained of their protector. They clustered near their mothers, sensing the adult's fear, even if they could not fully understand its source. The very air in Thornwick seemed heavier, as if the approaching loss was already pressing down on every soul within the settlement's walls. Through it all, Inga continued her work, seemingly untouched by the despair that had settled over the community like morning fog. She chopped vegetables with mechanical precision, tended the fires that kept the great cauldrons bubbling, and responded to requests with the same steady competence she had shown for years. But those who knew her well might have noticed the way her gaze lingered on the doorway that led to Einar's chamber, or how her hands paused sometimes in their tasks, as if listening for sounds that never came. As the evening stretched toward night and the last of the day's visitors departed Einar's bedside, Inga found herself alone in the kitchens for the first time since word of his condition had spread through Thornwick. The wooden spoon felt different in her hand as she stirred the broth that would likely go uneaten, heavier somehow, as if it remembered its true purpose, after years of hiding in plain sight. Her grandmother's voice echoed across the decades, speaking words that had once seemed like children's stories but now carried the weight of prophecy. The hands that feed can also heal, child. The herbs that flavor can also cure. When the time comes, you will know what must be done. Inga set down the spoon and walked to the small storage room where she kept her personal belongings. Hidden beneath folded linens and carefully preserved behind a loose stone in the wall, a leather pouch waited patiently for the moment she had always known would come. Inside, wrapped in silk that had once been white but now showed the yellowing of age, lay the tools and knowledge that connected her to a line of wise women stretching back beyond memory. Tonight, perhaps, it would be time to remember who she really was. Dawn brought no relief to Thornwick, only the cruel clarity of daylight that revealed how much ground Einar had lost during the night. His breathing had grown more labored, each inhalation a visible struggle that seemed to echo through the great hall like the death rattle of the clan itself. The fever that painted his skin in angry reds and yellows had intensified, and even from the doorway, visitors could feel the unnatural heat radiating from his body. Ragnhild emerged from his chamber with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks, no longer bothering to hide her defeat. "The poison has reached his heart," she whispered to the assembled clan leaders. "I can feel it in the way his pulse skips and races. By nightfall, we will be preparing his funeral pyre." The words hit the gathered crowd like physical blows. Bjorn the Iron Hand, Einar's closest friend and second in command, sank onto a wooden bench as if his legs could no longer support him. 30 years we've stood together," he murmured. 30 years, and I always thought I would be the first to fall." Valdis the seer nodded gravely as she consulted the carved bones. One final time, in Einar's fevered visions, fragments of memory danced like smoke, battles fought, enemies conquered, moments of triumph that now seemed as distant as childhood dreams. But threading through the familiar scenes of warfare and glory came stranger images. A young woman with frightened eyes, offering him water from a wooden cup, the smell of burning thatch mixing with wildflowers, hands that trembled as they bound a wound with strips torn from a green dress. These visions made no sense to his fever-addled mind, yet they carried an emotional weight that felt more real than the pain racking his body. In his delirium, he reached for memories that seemed to dance just beyond his grasp, calling to something deep within his warrior's heart that had nothing to do with sword and shield. As the clan leaders gathered to discuss the funeral arrangements, Inga finished her morning tasks with unusual haste. The ancient leather pouch felt warm against her palm as she carried it through the corridors, its contents representing knowledge that had been passed down through generations of women who understood that healing required more than skill, it demanded courage. She paused outside the great hall, listening to the voices within. Magnus Ironbeard, the clan's eldest warrior, was already speaking of how they would divide Einar's responsibilities among the remaining fighters. "Young Olaf has the strength," he said, "but he lacks the wisdom. We will need to—" "Wait!" Inga's voice cut through the discussion like a blade through cloth, quiet but carrying an authority that made every head turn toward the kitchen doorway where she stood. A moment of stunned silence followed. In all her years at Thornwick, Inga had never interrupted a council meeting, never presumed to speak when the clan's leaders were making decisions. The breach of protocol was so unexpected that even Bjorn forgot his grief long enough to stare at her in surprise. "You dare interrupt," Magnus began, his face reddening with indignation. "I can heal him," Inga said simply, her green eyes meeting the gaze of each man in turn. "Give me one night alone with Einar, and I will bring him back from the threshold of death." The silence that followed was broken only by someone's nervous cough and the distant sound of wind through the rafters. Then laughter began, first a chuckle from one of the younger warriors, then spreading through the group like ripples on a pond. "The cook thinks she knows healing," Thorstein scoffed, his tone carrying all the condescension of youth and education. "Woman, I studied with the Holy Brothers in Lindisfarne. I have seen techniques that these northern lands have never imagined. If my knowledge cannot save him, what makes you think your kitchen wisdom could succeed?" "Because," Inga replied, her voice remaining steady despite the mockery surrounding her, "your knowledge comes from books and other men's words. Mine comes from women who understood that life flows through channels your learning has never explored." Ragnhild looked up sharply at these words, something in Inga's tone awakening recognition in the old healer's eyes. "Child," she said slowly, "what exactly are you claiming to know?" Inga opened the leather pouch and withdrew a small bundle of dried herbs that filled the air with a scent both foreign and familiar. "My grandmother's grandmother learned from the wise women of the eastern lands, where they say healing is an art older than any religion. She taught her daughter, who taught her daughter, who taught me before the raiders came." The laughter died abruptly as the full import of her words settled over the group. In the Norse lands, certain knowledge was passed down only through bloodlines, protected jealously, and shared only when death threatened to break the chain of transmission. If Inga truly carried such inheritance, her offer demanded serious consideration. Even if what you claim is true, Magnus said, his voice now holding grudging respect alongside skepticism, why have you never spoken of this before? Why work in the kitchens when you could have stood beside our healers? Because, Inga replied, her hand closing protectively around the herb bundle, some knowledge is too precious to waste on everyday ailments. What I carry was meant for moments when death itself must be challenged. Bjorn rose slowly from his bench, his warrior's instincts recognizing something in Inga's bearing that spoke of hidden depths. If she speaks truth, he said, his voice hoarse with desperate hope, then we have nothing to lose. Our friend is already dying. Let her try what our trained healers could not accomplish. And if she fails, Thorstein demanded, if her hedge magic hastens his death, the responsibility will fall on all of us for allowing this foolishness. The responsibility is already ours, Valdis said quietly, her seer's sight reading currents invisible to others. I see possibilities. Threads of fate that twist in directions my vision cannot follow. Perhaps the gods have sent us aid in the form we least expected. The debate continued for several more minutes, but Inga could see the tide turning. Desperation was a powerful ally, and Thornwick had exhausted all conventional hope. When Magnus finally called for a vote, only Thorstein and two of the younger warriors opposed, giving her the chance she requested. One night, Magnus declared, his voice carrying the weight of formal decision. You will have one night alone with Einar. But understand this, woman, if your attempt fails, if he dies under your care, the clan will hold you responsible for hastening the end of our greatest protector. Inga nodded solemnly. I understand the weight of what I ask, but I also understand the weight of letting him die when I might have saved him. As the council dispersed and word spread through Thornwick of the strange bargain that had been struck, Inga returned to her small chamber to prepare. The leather pouch contained more than herbs. It held the accumulated wisdom of generations of women who had stood at the boundary between life and death, armed with nothing but knowledge, courage, and the unshakable belief that healing was the most sacred of all arts. Tonight, she would discover whether that inheritance was strong enough to pull the greatest warrior of the age back from the very threshold of Valhalla. As twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, Inga stood outside Einar's chamber with her ancient healing pouch clutched against her chest. The leather felt warm beneath her fingers, as if the knowledge contained within recognized the moment for which it had been preserved across generations. Through the heavy wooden door came the sound of labored breathing, each rasp a reminder of how little time remained. The hallway buzzed with nervous energy as clan members gathered to witness this unprecedented event. Some whispered prayers to the old gods. Others muttered skeptical observations about kitchen wisdom and desperate foolishness. Ragnhild approached with a bundle of clean linens, her weathered face creased with concern. "Child," the old healer said quietly, "I have tended the sick and dying for 40 years. What I see in there." She paused, struggling with words. "The poison has spread too far. His body burns with fever, while his spirit grows cold. Are you certain of what you attempt?" Inga met her gaze steadily. "I am certain that doing nothing means watching him die. Beyond that, I trust in knowledge older than either of us." As she opened the chamber door, the assembled crowd fell silent. Inside, the air hung thick with the smell of sickness and impending death. Einar's massive frame seemed diminished beneath the furs, his face flushed with fever, while his lips had taken on an ominous blue tinge that spoke of failing circulation. His breathing came in short, painful gasps that rattled in his chest like stones in a leather bag. Inga closed the door firmly behind her, shutting out the watching eyes and anxious whispers. In the sudden quiet, broken only by Einar's labored breathing, she felt the weight of her grandmother's teachings settle around her like a familiar cloak. The first lesson had always been the same. Healing begins with seeing, not just looking. Feel the currents of life, child. Sense where they flow strong and where they falter. She approached the bed slowly, her hands already reaching for the tools that would help her assess what conventional healing had missed. From the ancient pouch came a collection of items that would have seemed like simple trinkets to most observers: smooth stones worn by countless fingers, dried herbs that released their secrets only to those who knew how to ask, and small vials containing preparations that had been refined through generations of careful experimentation. The first step was to truly understand poison's path through Einar's body. Inga placed her hands on his forehead, closing her eyes and letting her fingers read the story written in his fevered skin. The heat was not uniform. It flowed in patterns that revealed how the toxin moved through his blood, pooling in some areas while avoiding others entirely. Her grandmother had taught her to feel for the places where life force gathered and dispersed, to sense the invisible currents that carried vitality through flesh and bone. As her hands moved carefully over Einar's chest and arms, she began to map the battlefield where his body fought its losing war against the poison. "The corruption enters here," she whispered to herself, her fingers finding the original wound in his thigh. "But it travels along the blood roads, seeking the heart. And there—" her hands paused over his left side. "There, it pools and grows strong." From the healing pouch, she withdrew a small clay jar containing a paste that had taken her grandmother 3 years to perfect. The mixture contained willow bark for pain, but also rarer ingredients: powdered pearls from northern seas, ash from rowan trees struck by lightning, and the dried blood of a white hart, obtained only through careful negotiation with hunters who understood its sacred nature. As she began to apply the paste to specific points on Einar's body, focusing on the areas where she sensed the poison's strongest hold, his breathing seemed to ease slightly. The improvement was subtle, a fraction longer between each labored breath, a slight decrease in the frantic rhythm that had marked his struggle against death. Outside the chamber, the waiting crowd grew restless. Bjorn paced the length of the hallway repeatedly, his heavy footsteps marking time like a funeral drum. Magnus sat on a bench with his head in his hands, while Thorstein stood near the door, clearly straining to hear any sounds that might indicate success or failure. "How long does this witch work take?" young Olaf asked, his voice tight with anxiety. "As long as it takes," Valdis replied, her seer's sight picking up currents invisible to others. "I sense shifting. The weaving of fate changes even as we wait." Inside the chamber, Inga continued her careful work. The ancient knowledge flowed through her hands as naturally as breathing, each technique perfectly preserved, despite the years of hiding her true nature. She prepared a tea from herbs that most healers considered too dangerous to use: foxglove for the heart, deadly nightshade in doses so small they seemed meaningless, and wolfsbane gathered only during the dark of the moon. The preparation required precise timing and perfect balance. Too little, and the mixture would have no effect against poison already so advanced. Too much, and she would kill the man she sought to save. But her hands moved with inherited certainty, measuring quantities by feel rather than sight, trusting in knowledge that had saved lives for countless generations. As she held the cup to Einar's lips, coaxing the barely conscious warrior to swallow tiny sips of the bitter brew, she began the words her grandmother had taught her: not quite prayer, not quite incantation, but something that seemed to bridge the gap between human effort and divine intervention. "Life calls to life," she whispered, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in the very stones of the chamber walls. "Blood calls to blood, spirit calls to spirit. What was sundered, let it be made whole. What was poisoned, let it be cleansed. What was dying, let it live again." The words came not just from her lips, but from some deeper place within her soul, drawing on wells of power that she had spent years learning to access. As she spoke, her hands continued their work, applying pressure to points that directed healing energy toward the areas where it was most needed. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, Einar's breathing began to change. The desperate gasps gave way to deeper, more regular respirations. The flush of fever started to fade from his cheeks, replaced by a pallor that spoke of genuine rest rather than approaching death. His pulse, which had been racing like a frightened bird's, began to slow to something resembling normal rhythm. By the time midnight bells rang from the small chapel that served Thornwick's Christian converts, Inga could see clear signs that her healing was taking hold. The poison's advance had been halted, perhaps even reversed. Einar's body temperature, while still elevated, no longer carried the furnace heat that had marked his decline toward death. She settled into a chair beside his bed, knowing that the most critical hours were still ahead. The ancient healing required constant attention, careful adjustments as the patient's condition changed, and the kind of vigilant care that could only be provided by someone who truly understood what forces were at work. Outside the chamber, the waiting continued. Dawn's first light crept through the narrow window of Einar's chamber, revealing a scene that would have seemed impossible just hours before. The warrior's breathing had settled into the deep, rhythmic pattern of genuine sleep rather than fever-induced delirium. The angry flush that had painted his skin in shades of impending death had given way to the pale but healthy complexion of a man whose body was finally beginning to heal. Inga had not slept. Throughout the night, she had maintained her vigil, adjusting her treatments as Einar's condition gradually stabilized. Her hands moved with practiced precision, applying cooling cloths when the fever spiked, administering careful sips of herbal preparations when his body could accept them, and monitoring the slow but steady retreat of the poison that had nearly claimed his life. As morning brought the sounds of Thornwick awakening, she heard voices gathering in the hallway outside. The night watch had been reporting regular updates to those who waited. But the news had been cautiously hopeful rather than triumphant. No one dared to believe that a miracle might actually be occurring within these walls. Einar's eyes opened for the first time in 3 days, blinking slowly as consciousness returned like tide filling an empty pool. His gaze wandered around the chamber with the confusion of a man who had traveled far from the land of the living and was surprised to find himself back among the familiar surroundings of his own room. "Water," he whispered, his voice barely audible but carrying the unmistakable cadence of rational thought rather than delirious rambling. Inga leaned forward, offering him small sips from a cup that contained not just water but a carefully prepared mixture designed to support his continued recovery. "Slowly," she advised, her own voice hoarse from hours of whispered incantations and careful observation. "Your body must remember how to accept nourishment." As Einar drank, his eyes focused on her face with growing awareness. Recognition flickered across his features, not just of Inga the cook, but something deeper, more complex. His free hand moved restlessly beneath the furs until his fingers encountered the silver arm ring that had been placed beside him when the healers first tended his wounds. The ring was a treasure from his early days as a warrior, crafted by a master silversmith in exchange for protection during a particularly dangerous trading expedition. Its surface bore intricate knotwork patterns that caught and reflected light in ways that seemed almost alive. Einar had worn it through countless battles, considering it a talisman of sorts, though he had never been able to explain the sense of connection he felt to the piece. Now, as his fingers traced the familiar patterns, strange images flashed through his mind, images that seemed more like recovered memories than fever dreams. A young woman with green eyes and auburn hair, her hands trembling as she pressed something smooth and cool against a wound, the scent of wildflowers mixed with smoke. A voice speaking words of comfort in accents that suggested she came from lands far to the south. "I know you," he said suddenly, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Not just from the kitchens. From before. From somewhere else." Inga's hands stilled on the cup as she met his gaze. For a moment, the careful composure she had maintained throughout the long night wavered, revealing glimpses of emotions she had spent years learning to hide. "You are still weak from the fever," she said carefully. "Memory plays tricks when the body has been so close to death." But Einar's warrior instincts, honed by decades of reading opponents and assessing threats, detected the slight tremor in her voice that suggested she was not telling the complete truth. He studied her face with new intensity, noting details that his previous encounters with the clan's cook had never given him reason to observe. Her hands, though stained with kitchen work, moved with a healer's precision and confidence. Her voice, when not carefully modulated to reflect her humble station, carried hints of education and refinement that spoke of a background far more complex than her current circumstances would suggest. Most tellingly, her eyes held depths of experience that seemed at odds with the simple life of a widowed servant. "The silver ring," he said, his fingers closing around the ornament. "You recognize it. I can see the knowledge in your eyes." Before Inga could respond, voices erupted in the hallway outside as the first reports of Einar's consciousness reached the waiting crowd. Bjorn's booming laughter echoed through the corridors, followed by the rapid shuffle of feet as word spread through Thornwick like wildfire. "He wakes!" someone shouted. "The warrior lives!" The celebration that followed could be heard throughout the settlement as news of the miracle spread from house to house. People who had spent the night in prayer or sleepless worry suddenly found themselves embracing neighbors, weeping with relief, and offering thanks to whatever gods or powers had intervened to save their protector. Magnus Ironbeard was among the first to reach the chamber door, his weathered face transformed by a smile that seemed to take years off his appearance. "Inga," he called through the thick wood, "the clan owes you a debt that can never be repaid. You have given us back our shield and our hope." But even as the celebration swirled around them, traditional voices began to express concern about the methods that had achieved this impossible healing. Thorstein's educated skepticism warred with the undeniable evidence of success, while some of the older clan members worried about what foreign influences might have been introduced into their community. "Hedge magic," muttered Astrid the Weaver, whose opinions carried significant weight among the settlement's women. "What price will we pay for trafficking with powers we do not understand?" Ragnhild, however, had spent the night in her own chamber, consulting texts and memories that stretched back to her own training as a young woman. When dawn broke, she emerged with the expression of wonder and deep respect that silenced many of the doubters. "What Inga carries is not foreign magic," she announced to the gathered crowd. "It is the old knowledge, the healing ways that our grandmothers' grandmothers practiced before they were driven into hiding by those who feared what they could not understand. She is not a witch, she is a keeper of ancient wisdom." Inside the chamber, Einar continued to study Inga's face as his strength slowly returned. The silver arm ring seemed to pulse with warmth in his palm, as if responding to some memory that danced just beyond his conscious reach. Whatever connection existed between them, whatever history they shared, he was determined to uncover the truth. "When I am strong enough to sit up properly," he said, his voice gaining authority with each passing moment, "you and I will speak of silver rings and green-eyed healers. There are questions that demand answers." Inga nodded, knowing that the moment of reckoning she had both dreaded and anticipated for years was finally approaching. The healing was only the beginning of a much larger story that would soon demand to be told. 3 days after his awakening, Einar had progressed from barely conscious whispers to sitting propped against thick pillows, his legendary strength returning in measured increments. The broken leg remained splintered and painful, but the poison that had threatened his life had been completely purged from his system. Color had returned to his weathered features, and his eyes held the sharp intelligence that had made him both a feared warrior and a respected leader. Inga continued her careful ministrations, bringing specially prepared meals designed to rebuild his strength and monitoring his progress with the practiced eye of someone who understood that healing was as much art as science. Their conversations during these recovery sessions had gradually evolved from simple exchanges about his needs to deeper discussions that revealed the complexity of both their backgrounds. Tell me about your grandmother's teachings, Einar said as Inga adjusted the bandages around his wounded leg. His voice carried genuine curiosity, rather than the suspicion that many clan members still harbored about her unconventional methods. She was a remarkable woman, Inga replied, her hands working with gentle efficiency. Born in the southern lands where Roman knowledge mixed with older Celtic wisdom, she could read and write in 3 languages, understood the movements of stars, and knew which herbs could heal ailments that traditional remedies could not touch. How did she come to the northern territories? Deduce. Inga's movements paused almost imperceptibly before, resuming their careful rhythm. She came as many women do in times of war, fleeing violence that consumed her homeland. My grandfather found her tending wounded travelers on the road to Hedeby. He said she saved his life before he ever learned her name. The story carried echoes that resonated with Einar's own fragmented memories. Images of burning buildings and displaced people flickered through his mind, mixed with the persistent vision of green eyes and trembling hands that had somehow become central to his dreams. War creates many refugees, he said thoughtfully. I have seen entire villages emptied, their people scattered like leaves before the wind. Some carry nothing but the clothes on their backs. Others manage to preserve treasures beyond gold or silver, knowledge, traditions, skills that might otherwise be lost forever. As he spoke, Einar's hand unconsciously moved to the silver arm ring that now rested on a small table beside his bed. The ornament seemed to draw his attention repeatedly, as if its presence awakened something deep within his warrior's memory that refused to remain buried. Inga followed his gaze to the ring, her own expression growing thoughtful. "It is beautifully crafted," she observed. "The knotwork patterns speak of master smithing. Such pieces often carry stories of their own." "This one certainly does," Einar replied, his fingers tracing the intricate designs. "I acquired it during my early years as a warrior, though the circumstances were complicated." He fell silent for a moment, his eyes focusing on something far beyond the chamber walls. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of confession. There was a village, small, prosperous, known for their skilled craftsmen and rich fields. Intelligence suggested they were providing aid to our enemies, allowing raiders to shelter there between attacks on our settlements. My warband was ordered to investigate and, if necessary, take action. Inga's hands stilled, completely on the bandages, as she recognized the tone of a man confronting difficult memories. The chamber suddenly felt smaller, more intimate, as if the walls themselves were leaning in to hear this long-held secret. "What we found," Einar continued, his voice growing quieter, "was a community that had indeed been providing shelter not to raiders, but to refugees fleeing the violence that seemed to follow wherever armies moved. Families with children, elderly people too weak to continue their journey, wounded travelers who needed time to heal before moving on." His hand closed around the silver ring, and Inga could see the muscle in his jaw tighten as he forced himself to continue the story. "By the time we understood the truth, it was too late. Battle fever had taken hold, blood had been spilled, and the momentum of violence becomes difficult to stop once it begins. We burned what should have been protected, scattered what should have been sheltered, and destroyed what should have been preserved." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of long-carried guilt. Inga found herself holding her breath, sensing that she stood at the edge of a revelation that would change everything between them. "In the aftermath," Einar said, his voice now barely above a whisper, "as we searched through the ruins for anything of value, I found myself in a burned house where a young woman was tending to the wounded. She should have fled with the others, should have run when the fighting started. Instead, she had remained behind to care for those too injured to move." His eyes met Inga's with an intensity that made her feel as if he could see directly into her soul. She was perhaps 16 winters, with auburn hair that caught the light from the burning thatch above, and green eyes that held no hatred despite what my men and I had just done to her world. Inga's breath caught in her throat as the pieces of a puzzle 27 years in the making began to fall into place. The memories she had spent decades trying to forget suddenly rushed back with crystalline clarity. The smell of smoke and blood, the sound of her home collapsing around her, and the face of a young warrior who had stood in her doorway like an angel of destruction. "I was wounded," Einar continued, seemingly unaware of the shock that had frozen his healer in place. "A sword cut across my ribs that was bleeding freely. She could have let me die, probably should have, given what had been done to her people. Instead, she tended my wound with cloth torn from her own dress, gave me water from a cup that had somehow survived the destruction, and spoke words of comfort in a voice that seemed untouched by the hatred that should have consumed her." His hand opened to reveal the silver arm ring resting in his palm like an offering. When I tried to thank her, she pressed this into my hand. "Remember mercy," she said. "When you have power over others, remember mercy." Then she disappeared into the smoke and confusion, and I never saw her again. The ring caught the light from the chamber's single window, its knotwork patterns seeming to pulse with the rhythm of a living thing. Inga stared at it, as if seeing a ghost from her own past made manifest in silver and memory. "Until now," Einar finished, his eyes never leaving her face. "I never saw her again until now." The silver ring lay between them like a bridge across 27 years of buried pain and forgotten grace. Inga's hands trembled as she reached for the ornament, her fingers recognizing its weight and texture with the certainty of muscle memory. When she held it up to catch the light, her green eyes reflected the same patterns that had been etched into Einar's dreams for nearly 3 decades. "You were just a boy," she whispered, her voice carrying the accumulated weight of years spent remembering that terrible day. "Tall for your age, but still a boy playing at being a warrior. Your hands shook when you tried to stanch the bleeding from your wound." Einar's breath caught as her words unlocked memories he had thought lost forever. "You sang while you worked," he said wonderingly. "A lullaby in the southern dialect, something your mother had taught you. I didn't understand the words, but the melody made the pain seem distant and unimportant. Gentle sleep, gentle dreams, let the morning bring you peace," Inga recited, the ancient words flowing from her lips as naturally as breathing. "My grandmother's song, learned from her grandmother in turn. I sang it because you looked so young and frightened beneath all that borrowed warrior's swagger." As Einar grew stronger over the following days, their conversations deepened beyond the careful revelations of that first recognition. He had progressed to sitting in a chair beside the window, his broken leg propped on a wooden stool, while afternoon sunlight painted golden squares across the chamber floor. The simple act of being upright again seemed to restore some of his natural authority, though Inga noticed how he winced when he thought no one was watching. The rest of Thornwick had begun to treat Inga with a mixture of awe and uncertainty that she found both gratifying and troubling. Magnus Ironbeard had publicly declared her a treasure of the clan, worthy of respect and protection. Ragnhild had formally acknowledged her as a fellow healer, offering to share knowledge and resources. Even some of the younger warriors had begun greeting her with the careful courtesy they would show to any person whose skills had proved invaluable to the community. But not everyone celebrated her sudden elevation in status. Thorstein continued to mutter about foreign influences and dangerous precedents, while Astrid the Weaver had begun organizing whispered conversations among the settlement's women about what other secrets their humble cook might be hiding. "They watch me now," Inga told Einar during one of their afternoon conversations. "I can feel their eyes following me through the great hall, measuring my words, analyzing my actions for signs of whatever power they think I possess." "Is that not what you wanted?" Einar asked. "Recognition for your abilities, respect for your knowledge." Inga moved to adjust his leg splint, her touch now familiar enough that he barely tensed when she handled the still tender injury. "I wanted to save your life," she said simply. "Everything else is consequence I never fully considered." Her small dwelling, which she had been granted after Eric the Stout's death, reflected the careful balance she had maintained between hiding her true nature and preserving her heritage. The main room held the expected possessions of a clan servant: simple furniture, basic cooking implements, mending projects that demonstrated her usefulness to the community. But in a wooden chest beneath her narrow bed lay treasures that spoke of a far more complex history. Eric's shield, scarred from the battle that had claimed his life, hung on the wall like a monument to the protection she had once known and lost. The damage to its painted surface told the story of his final stand against raiders who had attacked a trading caravan, his death bought with the lives of 6 enemies who would never threaten innocent travelers again. "I loved him," she told Einar one evening, as they shared a simple meal in her chamber, his recovery now advanced enough to allow such visits. Not with the passion of youth, but with the deep affection that grows between people who understand each other's pain. "He knew about your background." "Some of it. He knew I carried knowledge that went beyond kitchen skills, knew that I had survived things that would have broken a lesser person. He never pressed for details, never demanded more than I was ready to give." Her fingers traced the shield's damaged rim. Perhaps that kindness was what allowed me to love him as much as I did. Einar studied her profile in the flickering candlelight, noting how grief and strength seemed to exist simultaneously in her expression. "And after he died, I thought about leaving Thornwick," she admitted. "There were places I could have gone, communities where healers are welcomed regardless of their methods or background. But this had become home. These people had become my responsibility, and—" She paused, seeming to wrestle with words that carried more weight than she was ready to acknowledge. And there was unfinished business here, debts that needed to be paid, connections that required understanding. She met his gaze directly. "Part of me always knew you would return to this place where your legend began. Part of me was waiting for the chance to complete what began in my grandmother's burned village." The admission hung between them like a confession of faith, revealing depths of feeling that went beyond the careful friendship they had been building. Einar reached across the small table to cover her hand with his own, his warrior's calluses rough against her work-worn fingers. "What began there was not just mercy," he said quietly. "It was the moment I learned that strength without compassion is merely brutality, that a true warrior protects rather than destroys. You gave me more than healing, Inga. You gave me wisdom that shaped every battle I fought afterward. And you gave me proof that even in the darkest moments, grace can appear in unexpected forms," she replied. "A young raider who could have taken what he wanted by force, but instead accepted a gift freely given." Outside her small window, Thornwick settled into the rhythms of evening, cooking fires being banked, children called in from their play, night watches taking their positions along the settlement's wooden walls, the sounds of normal life continuing despite the extraordinary events of recent days provided a comforting backdrop to their conversation. But even as they shared these intimate revelations, both understood that their growing connection faced challenges beyond the simple matter of different social positions. The past they shared contained trauma as well as grace, pain as well as healing. Whether love could truly bloom in soil watered with so much old grief remained a question that only time would answer. The morning that changed everything began like any other. Einar had progressed to walking short distances with the aid of a carved staff, his broken leg healing well enough to bear limited weight. Inga had been preparing his morning meal when he made an observation that seemed innocent enough at first. "The wild flowers in your garden," he said, settling carefully into his chair. "They're not native to these northern lands. Southern blooms that should not survive our harsh winters, yet they thrive under your care." Inga's hands stilled on the wooden bowl she had been filling with porridge. "My grandmother taught me how to coax. Life from stubborn soil," she replied, but something in her tone suggested deeper currents beneath the simple explanation. "Chamomile and lavender, calendula and comfrey." Einar continued, his warrior's eye for detail cataloguing each variety he had observed. The same flowers that grew wild in the meadows around. His words stopped abruptly, as memory crashed over him like a physical blow. Not the fragmented recollections that had been surfacing gradually, but complete, devastating clarity that left no room for doubt or gentle interpretation. The burned village had not been nameless. It had been Grenstead, known throughout the region for its master weavers and skilled herbalists. The young woman who had tended his wounds had not been a random refugee. She had been Inga, Eric's daughter of the village's most respected healer, keeper of knowledge that stretched back through generations of wise women. "You remember," Inga said simply, her voice carrying neither accusation nor surprise. She had been waiting for this moment, knowing that his returning strength would eventually unlock the memories he had spent decades trying to forget. "Grenstead," he whispered, the name falling from his lips like a stone into still water. "Your father was Eric the Wise, the man who could heal ailments that left other practitioners baffled. Your mother was Astrid of the Golden Voice, whose songs were said to mend broken hearts, as well as any herb could mend broken bones." The memories flooded back in devastating detail. Not just the burning and the violence, but the specific acts that haunted his dreams. The granary set aflame while families still sheltered inside. The old healer, Inga's father, cut down while trying to protect his precious collection of medical texts. The sound of Inga's scream when she found her parents' bodies in the ruins of their home. "I killed them," Einar said, his voice breaking under the weight of recognition. "Your family, your people, your entire world. I led the war band that destroyed everything you loved." Inga moved slowly to her small wooden chest, withdrawing something that had remained hidden beneath layers of carefully preserved cloth for 27 years. When she returned to the table, she carried a smooth river stone, its surface worn to perfect smoothness by countless years of water and weather. The Mercy Stone. Einar stared at the simple object, as if it were a serpent coiled to strike. He remembered pressing it into the young woman's palm during those final moments in the burned house, his clumsy attempt to offer something, anything that might serve as payment for the grace she had shown him. She had accepted it with the same quiet dignity with which she had tended his wounds, closing her fingers around the stone as if it were a precious gem rather than a meaningless pebble. "You kept it," he said wonderingly. 27 years, she confirmed, through marriage to Eric, through the long winters, when I thought I might freeze to death from loneliness, through every moment when I questioned whether mercy was wisdom or foolishness. I kept it because it reminded me that even in the darkest moments, people can choose to be better than their circumstances demand. The revelation hung between them like a chasm that could never be bridged. Everything that had grown between them during his recovery. The careful friendship, the growing attraction, the sense of destiny that seemed to draw them together suddenly appeared built on foundations of violence and loss that no amount of healing could repair. "How?" Einar asked, his voice raw with anguish. "How can you look at me without seeing the blood on my hands? How can you touch me without remembering what I took from you?" "Because," Inga replied, settling into the chair across from him, "I learned long ago that hatred is a poison that destroys the one who carries it more than the one it targets. Because you were 17 years old, following orders from men who should have known better, caught up in violence that none of you truly understood. That doesn't excuse—" "No," she interrupted firmly. "It doesn't excuse anything. But it explains why a boy who could have taken what he wanted by force instead accepted a gift freely given. Why a young warrior who had just participated in destroying a village could still recognize mercy when it was offered to him." She reached across the table to place the mercy stone in his palm, her fingers briefly covering his as she had done that day so long ago. "This stone represents the choice you made in that moment. Not the violence that brought you to my door, but the humanity that let you accept healing from the hands of your enemy." Einar closed his fingers around the stone, feeling its familiar weight settle into his palm like a missing piece of his soul finally returned to its proper place. "I have carried the guilt of Grenstead through every battle since that day," he admitted. "It has shaped every decision I made as a leader, every mercy I showed to defeated enemies, every moment when I chose protection over conquest." "I know," Inga said simply. "Why do you think I was able to heal you when others failed? The poison in your body was nothing compared to the poison you have carried in your spirit all these years. My grandmother's knowledge could address the first, but only forgiveness could touch the second." The silence that followed was not the comfortable quiet they had grown accustomed to during his recovery, but something deeper and more complex, the sound of two souls recognizing each other across an impossible divide of pain and grace. "Where do we go from here?" Einar asked finally. "How do we build anything real on foundations laid with so much grief?" "The same way my grandmother's flowers bloom in northern soil," Inga replied. "Carefully, patiently, with the understanding that some things worth having require more tending than seems possible." She stood and moved to the window, looking out over the settlement that had become home to both their triumphs and their secrets. "The choice is yours, Einar Broadback. You can let this knowledge destroy what has grown between us, or you can accept that redemption sometimes comes in forms we never expected." When she turned back to face him, her green eyes held the same courage they had shown in the ruins of Grenstead, the willingness to offer grace even when every reason existed to withhold it. "I have spent 27 years learning to forgive the boy who helped burn my world," she said. "The question now is whether you can learn to forgive yourself." Word of the revelation spread through Thornwick like fire through dry grass. What had begun as whispered speculation about their growing closeness transformed into urgent debates about the implications of a love story built on such tragic foundations. The Mercy Stone's significance became common knowledge. When Bjorn, unable to contain his amazement at the story's complexity, shared details with trusted friends who proved less discreet than he had hoped. By the third day, after Einar's complete memory returned, the settlement buzzed with divided opinions that threatened to fracture the community's hard-won unity. The Great Hall hosted heated discussions that continued long into each night, with voices raised in passion as clan members struggled to reconcile their respect for both Einar's leadership and Inga's healing gifts with the uncomfortable truth of their shared history. Magnus Ironbeard found himself caught between competing loyalties and principles that seemed impossible to reconcile. As the clan's senior elder, he understood better than most how the violence of the past shaped the possibilities of the future. Yet he also recognized that both Einar and Inga had spent decades proving their worth to communities that might have justly rejected them. "The woman saved our greatest warrior," he argued during one particularly heated gathering. "Whatever happened in the past, she chose mercy over vengeance when she could have let him die. That choice speaks to her character more clearly than any ancient grievance." "But what of the precedent?" Thorstein countered, his educated voice cutting through the emotional arguments with legal precision. "If we accept this union, what message do we send to other communities? That raiders can return to claim what they once destroyed? That violence can be washed clean by the passage of time?" Astrid the Weaver had become the unofficial leader of those who questioned whether Inga's true motives were as pure as they appeared. "She has had years to plan this moment," the older woman insisted. "Who can say whether her healing was genuine mercy or elaborate revenge? Perhaps she saved him only to claim him, to complete some twisted justice that required his heart rather than his life." The debates took on added urgency as news arrived that delegations from neighboring clans were requesting meetings with Thornwick's leadership. Word of the impossible healing had spread beyond their borders, drawing attention from communities that wanted to understand both the methods employed and the larger implications of what had transpired. Einar himself had withdrawn from public view as he grappled with questions that had no easy answers. The ancient Decision Stone, a massive granite boulder carved with runic symbols that had presided over clan gatherings for generations, sat in the center of the great hall like a silent judge waiting for arguments to conclude. Tradition demanded that any decision affecting the clan's future be formally presented to the stone for consideration, but no one seemed certain exactly what decision needed to be made. The warrior's internal struggle was visible to anyone who cared to look. His physical recovery continued steadily, but the emotional weight of confronting his past had left him. Quieter, more withdrawn than anyone had seen him since his youth. He spent hours sitting beside Thornwick's small river, staring at the water while turning the mercy stone over and over in his calloused hands. Inga faced her own challenges as the community's attention focused on her with uncomfortable intensity. The respect she had earned through healing, Einar was complicated by suspicion about her motivations and fear about what other secrets she might be harboring. Some viewed her as a miraculous healer blessed by the gods, while others whispered about foreign magic and dangerous influences that might corrupt their traditional ways. Her daily routines became exercises in careful diplomacy as she navigated conversations that could explode into confrontation without warning. The simple act of preparing meals for the Great Hall required threading a path between supporters who wanted to celebrate her and detractors who watched for any sign that might justify their suspicions. "She watches him," observed Gudrun the baker, whose position near the kitchen windows gave her an excellent view of both Inga's work area and the river where Einar spent his contemplative hours. "Even when she's busy with her tasks, her eyes find him. That's not the look of a woman planning revenge, that's the look of a woman in love." "Or a hunter watching her prey," Astrid replied sharply. "Love and obsession can wear very similar faces, especially when the heart carries old wounds." The tension reached a breaking point when Olaf the Bold, emboldened by the controversy and his own ambitions for leadership, made a formal challenge to Einar's fitness to continue as the clan's primary war chief. The young warrior's argument was not based on physical capability. Everyone could see that Einar's strength was returning steadily, but on questions of judgment and moral authority. "How can we follow a man whose heart belongs to the past?" Olaf demanded during a public gathering. "How can we trust his decisions when his emotions are clouded by guilt and desire that stem from his worst moment as a young warrior?" The challenge forced the clan to confront questions they had been circling around for days. If Einar chose to pursue a relationship with Inga, would his leadership be compromised? Could a man whose legendary status was built on protecting the community be trusted when his personal desires might conflict with the clan's best interests? Bjorn rose to defend his oldest friend, his voice carrying the weight of 3 decades of shared battles and mutual trust. "Einar's judgment has kept us alive through countless threats," he declared. "His strength has been our shield, his wisdom our guide. Whatever questions exist about his personal choices, no one can dispute his value to this community." "That was before," Olaf pressed, "before his heart became entangled with complications that could affect every decision he makes. Can he lead us into battle, knowing that victory might require actions that would hurt the woman he loves? Can he negotiate with enemies while wondering if they might be connected to her past?" The question struck at the heart of leadership in a warrior culture where personal bonds could become vulnerabilities that enemies might exploit. Everyone present understood that a clan chief's emotional attachments were not merely private matters, they were potential strategic weaknesses that could affect the safety of the entire community. As the debate intensified, delegations from 3 neighboring clans arrived within 2 days of each other, each bringing their own perspectives on the situation. The Iron Wolves of the Eastern Territories had heard rumors of miraculous healing and wanted to learn if Thornwick possessed new knowledge that might benefit their own people. The Storm Crows from the northern fjords brought warnings about the political implications of harboring individuals whose backgrounds might draw unwanted attention from distant ennemis. The Ravenshold clan, Ancient allies with whom Thornwick had shared both victories and defeats came seeking clarity about whether their partnership agreements might be affected by changes in leadership structure. Each delegation required careful attention and diplomatic consideration, adding layers of complexity to decisions that were already challenging enough. The Great Hall hosted a succession of formal dinners, strategy sessions, and ceremonial gatherings that tested everyone's ability to maintain appearances while fundamental questions remained unresolved. Through it all, the decision stone sat in patient silence, its ancient surface reflecting candlelight and firelight as discussions swirled around it, night after night. The runic inscriptions seemed to shift in the dancing shadows, reminding observers that some decisions carried consequences that echoed across generations. Einar and Inga found themselves increasingly isolated as the community struggled with questions that touched on honor, justice, leadership, and love in ways that defied simple answers. Their few private conversations were stilted affairs, weighed down by awareness that every word might be scrutinized and interpreted by those who sought evidence for their various theories. Perhaps, Inga suggested during one painful exchange, the kindest solution would be for me to leave Thornwick, find a place where my presence would not create such division among people I have come to care about. No, Einar replied immediately, his voice carrying the absolute authority of command. Whatever we decide about the future, it will not be built on the foundation of your exile. This community owes you a debt that cannot be repaid by driving you away when your presence becomes inconvenient. And if staying means tearing Thornwick apart, then we find another solution, he said firmly, one that honors both the past and the present, that acknowledges what was lost while protecting what has been built. But finding that solution would require confronting the assembled clan in a formal gathering where every voice could be heard and every concern addressed. The decision stone waited, as it had for generations, for the moment when words would give way to action and the community would choose its path forward. The Great Hall had never held so many people within its walls. Every member of Thornwick's community had gathered for the formal assembly, joined by representatives from the visiting clans who had requested permission to witness the proceedings. The ancient decision stone occupied the center of the space like a silent arbiter, its carved surface seeming to pulse with anticipation in the flickering torchlight. Einar entered the hall, leaning heavily on his new walking staff, a masterpiece of carved oak that Bjorn had commissioned from the settlement's finest woodworker. The staff was more than a simple aid for his healing leg. It represented his transformation from a warrior who relied solely on strength to a leader who had learned to balance power with wisdom. Its surface bore intricate carvings that told the story of his legendary battles while incorporating newer designs that spoke of healing, mercy, and the complex relationship between violence and grace. The symbolism was not lost on the assembled crowd. As Einar made his way slowly toward the decision stone, every eye in the hall followed the rhythmic tap of the staff against the stone floor. Here was their greatest warrior, reduced to needing assistance for simple movement, yet somehow carrying himself with more dignity and authority than ever before. Magnus Ironbeard called the gathering to order with the traditional words that had opened such assemblies for generations. We come before the stone that has witnessed the wisdom of our ancestors, seeking guidance for decisions that will shape the paths of our children. Let all voices be heard. Let all concerns be weighed, and let the truth emerge from the fire of honest debate. Einar stepped forward, positioning himself directly beside the ancient stone as tradition required of any clan member whose actions were being formally evaluated. The decision stone's weathered surface seemed to dwarf even his imposing frame, reminding everyone present that individual lives were temporary, while the community's need for wisdom endured across centuries. "I stand before you," Einar began, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the packed hall, "not as your war chief seeking to defend his position, but as a man asking his people to help him find the path that serves both honor and healing. A murmur ran through the crowd at this unexpected opening. Most had expected him to assert his leadership rights or defend his relationship with Inga against the various challenges that had been raised. Instead, he seemed prepared to submit his fate entirely to the community's judgment. 27 years ago, he continued, I participated in an action that destroyed a village called Grenstade. I was young, following orders, caught up in the momentum of violence that I thought was justified by the information we had been given. What I learned too late was that our intelligence was wrong, our targets were innocent, and our actions destroyed exactly the kind of community we had sworn to protect. The hall fell silent, except for the crackling of torches and the soft sound of breathing from nearly 100 people hanging on every word. Even the representatives from other clans leaned forward, understanding that they were witnessing something far more significant than a simple leadership challenge. Among the people we wronged that day was a young woman named Inga Eriksdottir, daughter of healers, keeper of ancient knowledge, survivor of violence that should never have touched her world. Einar's gaze found Inga in the crowd, drawing strength from her steady presence. In the aftermath of that destruction, when she had every reason to hate everything I represented, she chose mercy instead of vengeance. She tended my wounds, offered me comfort, and sent me away with a gift that carried a message I have spent decades learning to understand. He reached into his belt pouch and withdrew the mercy stone, holding it up so that its smooth surface caught the torchlight and seemed to glow with inner fire. This stone represents the choice between cycles of violence and the possibility of grace. It has guided every decision I have made as your leader, every moment when I chose protection over conquest, every time I showed mercy to defeated enemies who might have expected death. Olaf the Bold shifted restlessly near the back of the hall, clearly impatient to present his challenge, but the formal structure of the assembly required him to wait until Einar had finished his opening statement. The young warrior's supporters watched their leader with growing concern as Einar's words began to weave a narrative that was far more complex and compelling than they had anticipated. The woman who saved my life that day has now saved it again, Einar continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. When your healers could not touch the poison that was killing me, when death seemed certain, Inga stepped forward with knowledge and courage that pulled me back from the very threshold of Valhalla. She had every reason to let me die, perhaps should have, given our history. Instead, she chose healing. He paused, letting the weight of that statement settle over the assembled crowd. The question before us tonight is not whether I am fit to lead, though I welcome any challenge to my authority that serves the clan's best interests. The question is whether this community has the wisdom to choose grace over grievance, healing over hatred, the future over the past. The walking staff stood firmly, planted beside him as he concluded his opening remarks, its carved surface catching the light like a beacon of the transformation that had brought them all to this moment of decision. The silence that followed Einar's opening statement stretched long enough for the torches to flicker and settle, their flames casting dancing shadows across faces that reflected a spectrum of emotions, from admiration to uncertainty to outright skepticism. When Magnus finally called for responses, the first voice to rise came from an unexpected source. I would speak for the woman who saved our protector. Old Ragnhild stepped forward, her aged frame somehow commanding despite her diminutive size. As the hall's senior healer, her words carried weight that even the most skeptical would find difficult to dismiss. For 40 years, I have tended the sick and wounded of this community, she began, her voice clear despite her advanced age. I have seen healing that bordered on miraculous and failures that haunt my dreams. What Inga accomplished with our dying war chief was not luck, not foreign magic, not some elaborate scheme for revenge. It was knowledge applied with wisdom, skill exercised with compassion, and courage demonstrated in the face of impossible odds. She moved closer to the decision stone, her own walking stick tapping against the floor in counterpoint to the continuing silence. More than that, she has offered to share her knowledge freely with any who would learn. She seeks no special position, demands no unique privileges, asks for nothing but the chance to continue serving a community that has become her home. Murmurs of agreement rippled through portions of the crowd, but the response was far from universal. When Ragnhild stepped back, Thorstein immediately moved forward to present the opposing view. "Respect for our healer's wisdom cannot blind us to larger concerns," he declared, his educated voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to legal argumentation. "We are asked to approve a union built on foundations of violence and deception. How can we trust that this woman's feelings are genuine when they are entangled with trauma that no amount of time can fully heal?" He gestured toward where Inga sat among the assembled clan members, her face composed despite the intensity of scrutiny focused upon her. "She has lived among us for years without revealing her true identity. She has maintained deception about her background, her abilities, her connection to events that shaped our war chief's character. What other truths might she be hiding? What other secrets might emerge to divide our community?" Astrid the Weaver nodded approvingly at these words, rising to add her own concerns. "And what of the precedent we set? If we approve this match, do we tell the world that Viking warriors can return to claim what they once destroyed? That violence can be forgiven simply because time has passed and hearts have changed?" But before the opposition could build momentum, Inga herself stood and moved toward the decision stone. The action was unexpected. Women rarely spoke at formal clan assemblies unless specifically invited, and no one had yet requested her testimony. Yet something in her bearing, some quality of quiet determination, caused the protests to die before they could fully form. "I ask permission to speak for myself," she said simply, her voice carrying clearly through the suddenly hushed hall. Magnus looked uncertain, glancing toward the other elders for guidance on this breach of protocol. But Valdis the seer nodded slowly, her mystical sight apparently detecting currents that others could not perceive. "Let her speak," the wise woman advised. "Some voices carry truths that transcend tradition." Inga approached the ancient stone with steady steps, her hands empty except for something small that she withdrew from a hidden pocket in her dress. When she reached the stone's base, she held up a simple circlet woven from dried herbs and wildflowers, the plants she had cultivated in her garden, the same species that had grown wild in the meadows around Grenstead. "This is a healer's crown," she announced, her voice growing stronger as she found her rhythm. "Not a symbol of rank or authority, but a reminder of responsibility. My grandmother wore one when she tended the sick. Her grandmother before her wore one when she guided births and eased deaths. It represents service, not power, the commitment to use knowledge for healing rather than harm." She placed the circlet on her head with ceremonial gravity, transforming herself from humble cook to something far more significant. "I stand before you not as Inga the widow, not as the woman who hides in kitchens and serves from shadows, but as the last daughter of Grenstead's healing tradition. I carry knowledge that my people died protecting, wisdom that raiders sought to destroy, skills that have survived because someone believed they were worth preserving." The transformation was remarkable. With the simple addition of woven herbs, Inga's entire presence seemed to expand, revealing depths of authority and knowledge that her humble circumstances had long concealed. "I have spent 27 years learning to forgive," she continued. "Not just the boy who helped burn my world, but the gods who allowed it to happen, the fate that scattered my people like leaves before the wind, and most difficult of all, myself for surviving when so many others did not." Her green eyes swept across the assembled faces, meeting skepticism with unwavering honesty. I did not save Einar's life to claim him as some twisted prize. I saved him because healing is what I do, because mercy is what I choose, because love, real love, builds bridges across chasms that hatred can only deepen. The healer's crown caught the torchlight as she turned toward Einar, its simple beauty somehow more regal than any golden circlet could have been. The vote, when it finally came, was not the narrow victory that many had expected, but an overwhelming affirmation that spoke to the transformative power of the evening's revelations. Even some who had arrived as skeptics found themselves swayed by the combination of Einar's vulnerability and Inga's dignified strength. The decision stone seemed to pulse with ancient approval as Magnus announced the result that would reshape both their individual futures and the community's understanding of forgiveness. 3 months later, as spring brought new life to the fjords around Thornwick, the settlement prepared for a wedding that had become the talk of the Northern Territories. Representatives from a dozen clans had requested permission to attend, drawn by curiosity about the union that had sparked debates in great halls throughout the region. The ceremony itself reflected the unique nature of the couple it celebrated. Traditional Norse customs blended with elements that honored Inga's heritage, creating a ritual that acknowledged both their individual histories and their shared commitment to building something new from the foundations of old pain. Einar stood before the gathered community, wearing his finest clothes, but the most significant element of his appearance was the walking staff that had come to symbolize his transformation. No longer needed for physical support as his leg had healed completely, it remained at his side as a reminder that true strength sometimes required acknowledging vulnerability. Inga approached the ceremony, wearing a dress of deep green that complemented her eyes and honored the healing traditions she represented. Around her waist was tied a cord woven from threads that carried symbolic weight, silver strands representing Einar's warrior heritage, green fibers from her grandmother's garden, and golden threads contributed by women throughout Thornwick who had come to respect her knowledge and character. The unity knot that bound their hands during the ceremony incorporated all these elements, creating a visual representation of how their separate stories had become one strong, unbreakable bond. As they spoke the ancient vows that committed them to shared futures, the assembled crowd witnessed something that transcended simple romance, a demonstration that love could indeed bloom in soil watered with old grief, if tended with patience and grace. Bjorn the Iron Hand served as Einar's witness, his booming laughter frequently interrupting the more solemn moments as he shared stories of his friend's transformation from feared warrior to thoughtful leader. "I have stood beside this man through 30 years of battles," he declared during the feast that followed the ceremony. "I have seen him face enemies that would break lesser hearts. But I have never seen him show more courage than when he chose to open his heart to healing rather than close it to protect old wounds." Ragnhild had officially recognized Inga as her successor, acknowledging that the clan's healing traditions would be strengthened by incorporating the ancient knowledge that had been preserved through her grandmother's line. "She has already begun teaching the young women of our community," the old healer announced proudly. "Knowledge that might have died with her will now live on in new hands." The celebration continued for 3 days, with delegations from visiting clans participating in competitions, sharing stories, and negotiating agreements that would strengthen the bonds between communities throughout the region. The wedding had become more than a personal celebration. It served as a gathering that reinforced the networks of alliance and cooperation that helped all their settlements survive and thrive. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came on the final evening, when Einar and Inga slipped away from the festivities to walk beside the river where he had spent so many hours contemplating their impossible situation. The Mercy Stone rested in a place of honor in their new shared home, but its spiritual significance lived on in the choices they continued to make. "Do you ever regret the path that brought us here?" Inga asked as they watched the water flow past, carrying reflections of stars toward the distant sea. Einar considered the question seriously, his arm tightening around her shoulders as he weighed words carefully. "I regret the pain that was necessary for us to find each other," he replied finally. "I regret the years we lost, the people we couldn't save, the wounds that had to be inflicted before healing could begin. But regret the path itself? No. Some destinations are worth whatever journey is required to reach them." Their future stretched ahead with the promise of shared purpose that went beyond personal happiness. Inga's healing knowledge would serve the community for years to come, while her influence on Einar's leadership style would help shape a new generation of warriors who understood that true strength included the wisdom to choose mercy when circumstances allowed. The gardens around their home already showed the fruits of their collaboration, northern plants growing alongside southern varieties, traditional remedies supplemented by techniques that had traveled across vast distances and through countless hands to reach this place of new beginning. Children played in the settlement's common areas, their laughter echoing off walls that had recently witnessed intense debates about forgiveness and redemption. Some of these young ones would grow up knowing the full story of their legendary protector and his healer wife, understanding that even the most impossible wounds could be mended when people chose grace over grievance. As night settled over Thornwick and the sounds of celebration finally gave way to peaceful quiet, Einar and Inga walked home together through streets that had become the stage for their remarkable journey from ancient enemies to devoted partners. Behind them, the great hall stood ready for whatever challenges the future might bring, its ancient decision stone, patient as always, waiting for the next moment when wisdom would be required to guide the community through difficult choices. Their love story had become something larger than personal triumph. It served as proof that healing was possible even when wounds seemed too deep to ever close, that forgiveness could bridge gaps, that hatred could only widen, and that sometimes the greatest strength came from the most broken hearts, learning to beat together in rhythm with hope rather than fear. In the quiet of their shared chamber, surrounded by the accumulated treasures of two lives finally united, they discovered that some bonds truly did run deeper than memory, stronger than trauma, and more enduring than the violence that had shaped their separate paths toward this moment of perfect peace.